The NATO Secretary General just used two words no one in 77 years of alliance history has ever used: structural breakdown. May 16th, 2026, Mark Rutte, Brussels morning press conference after a night of frantic consultation. He is standing at a podium that has hosted every Secretary General since the alliance was founded, and he is saying what is publicly on record, captured by Reuters and CNN within minutes. He warned that the transatlantic partnership is tested to its limits and facing a risk of structural breakdown if trust cannot be urgently restored. Not tested, not strained, not experiencing friction. Structural breakdown. Let me tell you what makes those two words the most alarming thing said at a NATO podium in living memory. It is not the drama of the phrase, it is the specificity. Structural means Rutte is not describing a political disagreement between leaders that will resolve when the personalities change. He is describing a load-bearing failure in the architecture itself. The kind of failure where the building does not fall immediately, but the foundation has cracked in a way that cannot be repaired by goodwill and summits alone. And here is what produced it. Spain closed its airspace and barred use of Rota and Moron Naval Station. Italy denied landing rights at Sigonella for American bombers. France blocked overflights for munitions resupply to Israel. Three NATO allies, three documented public formal refusals to provide logistical support for American operations in the same conflict in the same month. Trump called them cowards on Truth Social. Then on Air Force One returning from Beijing, upgraded the language to stabbed us in the back. And the Secretary General of the alliance those allies belong to stood at a Brussels podium the next morning and said the word that no one was supposed to say out loud: structural breakdown. If this is the kind of documented structural analysis that tells you what the phrase actually means rather than what the official framing needs it to mean, then subscribe now. One click, then stay. Because what comes after structural breakdown is the most consequential story about American military power since the Iraq coalition fractured in 2003. Let me build this from the verified sequence. 100,000? That is the number of American troops across Europe according to long-standing Defense Department posture data reported by the Wall Street Journal in April 2026. 100,000 across Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, and the United Kingdom. 40,000 in Germany alone. The physical manifestation of a security guarantee that has been the foundation of European political stability since 1949. Those troops exist because the alliance rests on a mutual understanding. America provides the deterrence architecture, the intelligence sharing, the logistical backbone, the nuclear umbrella. Europe provides the forward territory, the political legitimacy, the coalition depth that converts American military power from unilateral action into internationally sanctioned collective defense. For 77 years, that arrangement included an implicit assumption on the American side. When Washington goes to war, our bases are available. The airspace is open. The alliance delivers. February 28th, 2026, Operation Epic Fury begins. The Pentagon requests enhanced access to European facilities for refueling, rearming, and staging. The responses arrive in rapid succession. Spain, no. Rota and Moron will not be available for Iran-related operations, citing absence of UN mandate and NATO consensus, publicly stated in a press conference by the Prime Minister himself. Italy, no. Sigonella denied for American bombers, procedural and political concerns documented. France, no. Overflights carrying munitions to Israel blocked, formal diplomatic communication to Washington. Three countries, three refusals, all public, all documented, all legally grounded in the same argument. No NATO treaty obligation compels members to support offensive operations outside the North Atlantic area without consensus, and no consensus was sought before February 28th because Washington did not ask. That last part is the one that the official American framing consistently skips. Washington did not consult. Washington informed hours before strikes that would trigger a multi-month conflict with global energy consequences. And then it expressed shock when the Allies, informed after the fact, declined to provide logistical support for the operation they had been informed about rather than consulted on. That is not betrayal. That is the difference between consultation and notification. And that difference matters enormously for the domestic political situations of the leaders being asked to put their country's bases in service of a war their publics did not endorse. Stop. Sit with that for a moment. Then let me show you what it cost operationally, because that is where the structural breakdown language gets its weight. Every mile of additional route from denied airspace costs fuel. Every denied base force is rerouting that adds time. Every extra hour of flight time adds to munitions consumption. None of this appears in press conference language about the campaign proceeding on schedule. All of it appears in logistics, budgets, and sortie planning documents that reveal an operational tempo that is more expensive, more time-consuming, and more munitions-intensive than pre-conflict planning assumed. And here's the specific problem that the Sigonella denial created that nobody is saying plainly. Sicily is the geographic midpoint of everything between American carrier groups in the Gulf and the continental United States, between European ammunition stockpiles and the theater of operations. Sigonella has been the staging hub for American Mediterranean operations for decades. Denying it does not prevent the mission. It forces the mission to be conducted at greater distance, greater cost, and reduced operational efficiency consistently on every logistic cycle. For every week the denial is maintained. The cumulative effect is the story, not any individual sortie. The compounding of every additional mile flown, every extra fuel load consumed, every logistics cycle that takes longer because the nearest forward hub is unavailable. That cumulative effect is what Ruta was describing when he said structural breakdown. Not the political argument, but the operational consequence of the political argument being maintained over months. But here is what comes next, and this is where the April 8th White House meeting reveals the alliance dynamic in its most specific available documentary form. Ruta met Trump at the White House on April 8th in what both sides later described as frank and open. We know that in diplomatic language means one side said things the other side found extremely uncomfortable. Ruta emerged to tell CNN that Trump was clearly disappointed with many NATO allies, that some had been tested and failed amid the Iran crisis. Tested and failed. The Secretary General of NATO describing NATO allies using the phrase tested and failed. That is the most extraordinary sentence any NATO Secretary General has ever allowed himself to say in a non-classified setting. It is the institutional acknowledgement that the alliance, when tested by the specific combination of an American offensive operation, a Middle Eastern theater, and the absence of prior consultation, produced a result that fell below the standard the alliance is supposed to meet. So by May 4th, Trump escalated to announcing the withdrawal of 5,000 troops from Germany and placing Spain, Italy, and France on the internal naughty list, as reported in detail by the Wall Street Journal. By May 15th, stabbed us in the back on Air Force One. By May 16th, Ruta at the Brussels podium. That timeline is not 3 weeks of diplomatic friction. That is 3 months of documented escalation from bilateral operational request to Secretary General language about structural breakdown. The trajectory has been consistently in one direction. Now let me take you into the dual-track picture that connects the NATO fracture to the Iran strategy in a way that the separated coverage tracks consistently miss. Iran has been running 2 simultaneous tracks throughout this conflict. The military track, administrative control of the Strait of Hormuz through the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, vessel stops, naval asset deployment, the sustained friction that makes commercial operators price the strait as high risk. The diplomatic track, Pakistani intermediary channels, ceasefire framework, the signals of potential movement through Iraq's public statements. Both tracks benefit from extended American operational timelines. The longer each strike package takes to assemble, the longer each logistics cycle runs, the more expensive each sortie becomes, and the more the operational pressure on Iran's military posture is reduced relative to what the original campaign tempo promised. The base denials extended the operational timeline. Iran did not cause the base denials, but it used them. Iranian operational planners read the same news cycles, assessed the same operational consequences, and calibrated the military track accordingly. A campaign that costs more per sortie, takes longer per logistics cycle, and is consuming munitions from a stockpile already documented as depleted is a campaign whose political sustainability timeline is shorter than its operational requirements. That is the structural gift the base denials delivered to Iranian strategic patience, not through coordination but through the operational arithmetic of distance and cost. Watch for Iranian maritime behavior in the weeks following the May 16th Ruta statement. If administrative Hormuz control continues at a documented tempo, while the Pakistani channel simultaneously signals ceasefire framework engagement, the dual track is fully operational. The military track benefiting from extended American operational timelines, the diplomatic track maintaining the political space that prevents resumed maximum intensity operations, both running simultaneously, both calibrated against the documented evidence of what the NATO fracture has produced. But here's what comes next. This is the Indo-Pacific dimension that makes the Ruta statement the most alarming NATO development in decades for reasons that have nothing to do with Iran. Every operational constraint in the Iran theater, longer routes, higher per sortie cost, reduced logistics efficiency, is a constraint that American planners are managing while simultaneously being expected to maintain credible deterrence in the Western Pacific. The Taiwan contingency planning that American Indo-Pacific strategy is built around assumes European forward basing is available as a global logistics backbone for American power projection. If that basing is now conditional, even if European governments will evaluate American operational requests against their own legal and political calculus, then the Taiwan contingency planning needs revision that has not yet appeared in any public document, but is almost certainly underway in classified planning processes. Here is the specific alarm. The Taiwan contingency planning does not involve European bases in the direct operational sense. American carriers in the Pacific do not stage through Sigonella, but the global logistics architecture, the ability to move munitions, supplies, spare parts, and personnel at the pace and scale that sustain Pacific operations, depends on the European basing network as a global transit hub. Munitions manufactured in the United States, staged through European facilities, forward deployed to Pacific theater positions. If that transit hub is conditionally available, if the next operational request will generate a new set of naughty list calculations in Madrid, Rome, and Paris, then every Pacific operational timeline has to be recalculated with conditional rather than assumed European logistics access. That is a planning problem of the first order, and it is the planning problem that the structural breakdown language is the first public acknowledgement of. Watch for the specific Indo-Pacific ally response to the Ruta statement. Japan, South Korea, and Australia are watching the NATO fracture with the same attention they gave to the Iranian drone swarms and the THAAD production rate documentation. What they are assessing is not whether European theater allies will support American operations in the Pacific. They will not be asked directly. What they are assessing is what the NATO fracture reveals about the reliability of American alliance commitments when operations encounter domestic political resistance in host nations. If American allies in Europe can publicly refuse base access for American operations without the alliance collapsing, if the structural breakdown language is the consequence and not the end, then every Pacific ally is now running its own assessment of what their analogous refusal would cost them and what it would reveal about American commitment reliability. That assessment is happening in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Canberra. It will not appear in public alliance solidarity statements. It will appear in indigenous military capability investment, in requests for more specific American commitment language, and in the particular care with which Pacific allied governments choose their words when asked about alliance reliability. Now let me give you the strongest counterargument in the form that actually tests the analysis. The most coherent case for the European position rests on documented legal and political reality that is genuinely significant. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty is a collective defense obligation triggered by armed attack on a member state. It is not a blank endorsement of American offensive operations in any theater Washington defines as important. Iran did not attack a NATO member state before Operation Epic Fury began. The operations launched February 28th were a preemptive strike based on American and Israeli assessments of Iranian threat. European members have the legal right, and in some political contexts, the domestic legal obligation to decline participation in operations that lack UN mandate or NATO consensus authorization. The absence of prior consultation is the specific trigger that European governments cited, and it is legitimate. Washington chose to inform Allied capitals hours before strikes began. Information is not consultation. Consultation is the process that produces the domestic political buy-in that allows governments to provide logistical support for operations their publics will subsequently scrutinize. By skipping consultation, Washington skipped the process that would have generated the political basis for Allied support and then expressed shock at the absence of support. From this perspective, the structural breakdown describes not European failure, but the inevitable consequence of unilateral American operational decision-making in a treaty framework that requires collective deliberation for out-of-area operations. That argument is legally accurate. It is politically coherent in European domestic context, and it is the argument that European capitals will continue to make with increasing confidence as long as Washington's alternative to accepting it is more troop withdrawals and more naughty list tweets. Here is where the evidence diverges from the simple Europe was right reading. The countries refusing base access for American operations in the Gulf are the same countries whose energy supply chains are disrupted by the Hormuz closure that those operations are attempting to address. Spain, Italy, and France absorb elevated oil prices, elevated insurance premiums, and elevated supply chain costs from the same disruption that the denied airspace is making harder to resolve. They are simultaneously refusing to facilitate the solution to a problem they are bearing the economic cost of. That is not hypocrisy. It is the documented output of domestic political systems that can absorb economic pain from Hormuz disruption at the pump more easily than they can absorb the political cost of association with an American military campaign their publics did not endorse. The political cost of complicity arrives immediately. The connection between base denial and extended economic disruption is legible but diffuse. Understanding that political arithmetic does not make the base denials strategically wise, it makes them politically predictable. And predictable problems can be addressed through the consultation processes that prevent them from arising. But here is the alarm that the Ruta Statement documents most specifically. The naughty list mechanism, the troop withdrawal announcements, the internal administration punishment framework, the stabbed us in the back language, is not addressing the structural problem. It is addressing the symptom. The structural problem is that Washington launched a major offensive operation without consulting the allies whose logistical support the operation required. The symptom is that those allies declined to provide support they had not been consulted about providing. Withdrawing 5,000 troops from Germany addresses the symptom by imposing costs on the refusing allies. It does not address the structural problem because it does not create the consultation framework that would generate allied political buy-in for future operations before they begin. Every ally that watches the troop withdrawal as the consequence of base denial learns the same lesson. The cost of refusal is troop withdrawal. They calculate whether that cost exceeds the domestic political cost of providing support in some future contingency. For some European governments, the calculation will favor support. For others, it will not. The outcome is case-by-case calculation rather than reliable allied logistical commitment. That is the structural problem, and naughty list pressure applied without the consultation framework that would make the calculation consistent produces inconsistent outcomes in every subsequent contingency. Ruta's structural breakdown language is the first public acknowledgement that the current approach is producing inconsistent outcomes. That acknowledgement is the beginning of the structural problem being diagnosed accurately. It is not the beginning of the structural problem being solved. Watch for the specific NATO institutional response to the Ruta Statement over the coming 30 days. Not individual member government statements, but the institutional processes. Whether NATO schedules an extraordinary ministerial consultation on out-of-area operation protocols, whether the alliance's command structure produces any formal revision to the frameworks governing member state obligations for non-Article 5 operations, whether Ruta's frank and open language with Trump produces any documented change in the consultation process that precedes future American operational requests. Those institutional processes are the only mechanism through which structural breakdown becomes structural repair rather than the normalized baseline for conditional alliance participation. Watch for European defense budget acceleration. Statements from Berlin and Paris about reducing dependence on American guarantees are now documented in multiple public forums. The specific budget line items that follow those statements, joint European procurement, independent strike capability, intelligence architecture that reduces reliance on American platforms, will tell you whether European governments are recalibrating toward greater strategic autonomy in ways that compound the alliance fracture or complement it. Watch for the specific allied response from Eastern European governments. Poland, the Baltic states, Romania. These are the allies for whom American forward presence is not an arrangement, but an active deterrence signal against the threat they experience as immediate. The troop withdrawal announcement from Germany sends a signal to every Eastern European government about the reliability of American forward commitment as a deterrence instrument. If Eastern European governments begin separately requesting more specific American commitment language, binding language, prepositioned equipment language, the kind of security architecture that reduces dependence on American political follow-through, that behavioral signal tells you the naughty list mechanism has produced collateral damage in the relationships that matter most for European deterrence. Now let me take you to the forward picture. The next 90 days will follow the trajectory the Ruta statement established, because that statement defined the frame within which all subsequent alliance management has to operate. American operations in the Gulf will continue at the logistics costs the base denials imposed. Every additional week adds to the cumulative operational tax documented in fuel consumption, sortie timelines, and munitions expenditure. That tax does not disappear when political attention moves to the next crisis. It accumulates in the sustainment budgets that future operational planners will inherit.